The first question was a very interesting question. It said that if the Russians had not reacted negatively to Ukraine's interest in signing the association agreement, and let's say allowing Ukraine to become part of NATO and allowing Ukraine to become part of the EU, would Ukraine be in better shape today? I think the answer is yes, and I think Ukraine would look a lot more like Poland, which fits that description, than Ukraine today. But the key point is the Russians were not going to let that happen, and therefore it was not smart on the West's part, especially Washington's part, to push NATO expansion, EU expansion, and democracy promotion, all for the purpose of turning Ukraine into a Western bulwark. The second question was that the questioner pointed out that the United States is really the only country that seems to have a penchant or a proclivity for running around the world toppling governments. You don't see evidence that the Russians are interested in toppling governments the way the Americans are. I think that's absolutely correct. And I think what you have to understand, and this has bearing on a lot of the other questions, is that the United States views itself, as Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State, said, as the indispensable nation. The United States believes that it stands taller and it sees further than any other state on the planet. Most American policymakers, most American foreign policy elites believe that we have a right and a responsibility to interfere in the politics of every country on the planet. There's no question about that. And we are also, as you know, very powerful economically and militarily. So we are meddling in everybody's business. And this is why we place such a high premium on democracy promotion. So I agree with what that person said. Now, that person also said, did the Americans create the Ukraine crisis to save NATO because NATO is in trouble? This is an empirical question, and I see no evidence that the United States even created the crisis, much less for the purpose of saving NATO. Again, this is my point about Talleyrand. We wandered into this one blindly. Nobody saw it coming. Therefore, it's hard for me to believe that we did it for the purpose of saving NATO. Now, this gentleman said that I'm a realist and it's dangerous to look at this crisis through realist lens. And he emphasized a number of other theories or theoretical perspectives for thinking about this. And I'll just take one of them, which is institutionalism. First of all, I really didn't look at it through realist lens. I just tried to figure out what happened, and I went where the facts took me. And I did conclude at the end that, that Putin was acting as a realist, and the West was acting according to a more idealistic or a more liberal theory of foreign policy. And that included institutions. Now, this gentleman said to me, I think your problem is that you're not paying enough attention to institutions. But I think you're wrong. I was paying lots of attention to institutions. NATO is an institution. The European Union is an institution. So my point to you is that your beloved institutions are what caused this mess. It's just that those institutions were used in a very foolish way. Next question. And this is a question I think that's come up a number of times. Was the United States looking to take advantage of Russian weakness and basically wreck Russia? And the questioner asked me if we were you know, thinking about decapitating Russia with nuclear weapons. Now, I think we are not, as foolish as American foreign policy can be these days, we are not thinking about using nuclear weapons against Russia. What we are interested in doing, I believe, as I said before, is I think we would like to topple Putin from power if we could, right? But I want to make this point to you. You have to think about what we were thinking, what the West was thinking before this crisis, and what happened after the crisis. And again, there is no evidence that anyone was saying that Russia is dangerous and we have to decapitate it or even contain it before the crisis. It's really quite remarkable. Russia becomes the boogeyman. Russia becomes the font of all evil after February 22nd. And that's when we blame the Russians, and that's when we go after Putin. But again, I don't think we would use nuclear weapons. Somebody then pointed out a question about a 1979 book that said every conflict is about natural resources. I actually don't think that's true. I think that there's one natural resource that is a potential source of conflict, and that's oil. And I think that the reason the United States cares so greatly about the Persian Gulf is because of oil. But otherwise, I find it hard to imagine the United States actually getting into a war with Russia over resources or getting into a war with China over resources. So I don't deny that resources are sometimes a source of conflict, but I don't think that they are all the time. And I think the competition between Russia and the United States today, or Russia and the West today, and China and the United States, and China and Japan, is not about resources. By the way, just think about China and Japan. There's a scenario that really scares me. You know, they're fighting over these rocks in the East China Sea. It's hard to believe that China and Japan might go to war over these rocks. The Japanese call them the Senkaku Islands. The Chinese call them the Diaoyu Islands. There's no natural resources there. In fact, there's nothing there. I don't even think anybody lives there. They're just rocks. But this is nationalism at play. Now, the question was asked about Victoria Nuland and John McCain. And the point the questioner made, this was the last question, was that these people are interested in dominating the world. I think there's no question that's true. And I don't think Victoria Nuland and John McCain are that unusual in the American context. What we have in Washington is groupthink. Some people refer to going to Washington as going inside the bubble because the Republicans and the Democrats basically think alike. There's hardly any difference between Madeleine Albright and Paul Wolfowitz. We have liberal imperialists and neoconservatives, and they both think that we are the indispensable nation, and they think we have a right and a responsibility to run the world. There's no question about that. And that's what was behind NATO expansion. But I'm saying in that particular case, before February 22nd, we were not viewing Russia as a threat. We saw Russia as going down. Russia was weak. That's why we thought we could have this in-your-face strategy of NATO expansion and Russia would do nothing because it was a weakling, right? It was China that we really worry about. That's the potential peer competitor on the horizon for the United States. My basic view about the United States with regard to this issue is that the situation is almost hopeless. However, I have hoped all along that the Europeans, and especially the Germans, would pursue an enlightened policy and in a very important way, force the United States to go along. I think, by the way, this is what happened with regard to arming the Ukrainians. Obama was under a tidal wave of pressure to arm the Ukrainians because the sanctions are not working. And what I believe saved him was Angela Merkel came to the White House and told him in no uncertain terms that it would do enormous damage to the alliance, to the transatlantic alliance, if the Americans went ahead and armed the Ukrainians. So I think in that particular case, the Germans did exactly the right thing. I think, as I said to you before, in April 2008 at the Bucharest summit, Angela Merkel again did the right thing in fighting against NATO expansion. However, I don't think she and the German government have been doing the right thing in general since the February 22nd, 2014 coup. And I think going along with sanctions and trying to put more and more pressure on Putin and trying to continue to make Ukraine a part of the West is not the way to go. So I think the best thing that could happen in Germany is if a massive wave of support developed for diplomacy, for trying to make Ukraine a neutral buffer state, which it effectively was from 1991 to 2014, explicitly taking NATO expansion off the table, explicitly taking EU expansion off the table. If the Germans, and the German government in particular, began to push in this direction, the Americans would not have a lot of choice but to go along, because the Americans are very wary of causing a transatlantic split. So the fact is the Germans have a lot more leverage than they realize. But the problem with the Germans is that they don't like to exercise that leverage. Germans are very uncomfortable with power. They're very uncomfortable with the idea of getting tough with Uncle Sam. But I'll tell you something, it is in your interest to do everything you can to shut this one down. Because if we continue on the road that we're going down, this one is going to get worse and worse. And it's going to have much more negative consequences for you than it is for us. One of the reasons that we are so cavalier, so careless about the exercise of power is we have the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean between us and all of these hot spot areas. And furthermore, we are incredibly powerful. You Germans are on the front line here. Ukraine is not far away. You do not want this one to get worse. And if you let the Americans have their way, it will get worse. So I think it's high time for the Germans to stand up to the Americans and push a much more sensible policy, again, that emphasizes diplomacy and not military force, and making Ukraine basically a neutral buffer state.